People think Thailand is the Wild West out here in the East, yet what Thailand is today is a far more open and honest place than it was when I first went there. I want to share what happened to me, yet I don't want to give away too many details because it was part of a wider event that happened in Thailand. This incident received a lot of publicity in both the local and international press. I'm not going to be naming any names. And when I refer to certain things, while people who were on the ground at the time most likely will know what I'm talking about, I do aim to be vague enough so as to leave some modicum of doubt in the air. My story is centered on my ambition to do something very different in Thailand, a country that I found myself in for the first time in the early 1990s. Everything happened such a long time ago, and I am now back on my feet. I want to talk about it from my perspective and the lessons I learned from it, so that anyone who is complaining about Thailand today can rest easy knowing that things are nowhere near as bad as they used to be when it comes to things such as corruption, intimidation, and nefarious practices. I must point out that although I left Thailand for a considerable length of time after this happened, I am now back in Thailand, retired and happy, but it took a long time to get back on my feet. I love Thailand and I love living in Thailand, and I feel ever so grateful to be able to call this wonderful country my home. This is not me complaining in any way about the country. This is me just recounting something that happened to me and being caught up in something that affected lots of people. Some of these people were affected more than I was. Yet, what I was hoping would be my first foray into business in Thailand before expanding into other areas was a situation that ruined me and made me have to start again back at home. So please take that into consideration before commenting anything hurtful. I'm in my early 70s now, fortunate enough to still be able to get about without much issue, and fortunate enough to still have my health. God willing, hopefully this will continue. I was also fortunate enough to have been from a family that took me on lots of overseas trips when I was young, which at the time, when I was young, was something that not many people had the opportunity to do. I remember holidays to Spain in the 60s, a trip I went on to India during that same decade. But the adventure that stood out the most was when I was taken to Hong Kong with my family, where my father had got a job. I spent 2 years living in Hong Kong, from when I was 15 until just before my 18th birthday, and I count this experience as being one of the best things to ever happen to me. International travel opened my eyes to the world that at the time seemed to feel so much bigger than it actually was, and having the opportunity to live abroad during that time made me into the person I am today. I hope you will allow me to share my whole story, but I will give over the bulk of my story to my Thailand experience. But I would like to say how I got to being in Thailand in the first place, and I will try to get all that out of the way as quickly as possible, so I don't come across as being a delusional old man harking back to his youth. The reason I wanted to talk about my time in Hong Kong was because I grew up a lot during those 2 years. I feel like I went there and I was still a boy who didn't really know what he wanted to do with life, and Hong Kong in the late 60s was the perfect place to begin my story. At the time, Hong Kong was still British, so going there was par for the course. And this was my first time actually going somewhere with my father when he was working overseas. My mother went as well, but before it was usually a case of my father going to work by himself and coming back from time to time and spending time with the family. Hong Kong was the perfect introduction to the Far East. In a way, Hong Kong was the crossroads between the West and the East. I grew up reading about it, but at the time you had to read it in books, and your imagination had to play a lot bigger part of the picture than it does today, and that's something that I miss tremendously. It was strange seeing lots of British things, the buses, post boxes, yet lots of the Asian side to Hong Kong really made it feel like a melting pot between two worlds. Even back then, the view from Kowloon to Hong Kong Island was impressive. You could tell it was a city on the up, yet it still had a long way to go to reach where it is today. I do need to give an honorary mention to the Kai Tak Airport, which was right in the heart of the city. The memories are grand, and being there during the riots of '67, you could feel like change was in the air. I left Hong Kong back to England to attend university, but I couldn't shift the excitement that I felt when I was there. All of a sudden, England felt like it was the launch pad for a life overseas. Yet I was still English, and proud to be English, but I wanted to be an English person abroad, and I worked hard at university to make sure that I could return to Hong Kong and work there myself when the time was right. My parents returned to England a few years later. My father had got another job in another continent, but I wasn't interested to follow my father to where he was going, even though the opportunity presented itself to me, and I was offered a position working by his side. I wanted to take my own path in life, and after I completed my studies, I moved to Hong Kong to begin my career. It's not really important to say what my career was, because after I was in Hong Kong for only a year, I packed it in completely to open my first business. I just so happened to open a small bar on Hong Kong Island, and I ran that successfully for 5 years before selling up and returning to England for a business venture that my friend at the time asked me to invest in. Another 5 years of my life go by, and I'm bought out of the business by my friend, and life seems to be moving in the direction I always thought it would. My first businesses had been somewhat successful, but I'm nowhere near at the point where I can start taking it easy. That, for me, was not what I wanted to do. My story seemed to be only just at the start. With that in mind, I invested in another business in England. That was something I would run until it eventually failed 10 years later, and I lost a lot of money in that venture. It was a painful point of my life because up until then, I hadn't really failed at anything. And I decided I wanted to give myself a few months to get my head back in the game. This was in the early 1990s. As much as I loved Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was my first foray into Asia, I planned to go to Singapore to explore opportunities there. And I also planned to go to Thailand, which at the time was experiencing somewhat of an incredible boom. In 1992, I touched down in Singapore, and the country was still relatively easy to move to, and I looked at some possibilities when I was there, but ultimately decided that I preferred Hong Kong, and I left after a week thinking that as much as Singapore was interesting to me, I didn't really want to explore the possibility further. That's one of my regrets. If I had gotten into Singapore in the early 1990s, even though I lost a lot of money in my failed businesses back at home, I still had enough money that I could have invested at the time, and today that would be worth orders of magnitude more. But we can't look back at decisions we made and wish we made other ones based on information we didn't have available to us at the time. I left Singapore for Thailand, and I fell in love. There is no other way to describe it. Thailand was something else altogether. Whereas Hong Kong and Singapore had the British influence and it was excessive and everywhere you looked, England in the east. Though that may be an extreme way to describe it because it wasn't anything like that really, but when you were in Thailand, that, aside from the Japanese being there, were never colonized, they seemed to do things differently, and it was very exciting to see a place so different to anywhere that I'd ever been. What was meant to be just 10 days in Thailand turned into a month. I explored Bangkok, went to places down south, and did some of the island hopping that at the time was nothing more than going from one island that didn't have electricity, staying in a wooden hut on the beach for only 300 baht, to another island where they didn't even have running water at the hotel I stayed at. It was rustic, it was different, and I knew right there and then that Thailand would play a big part for the rest of my life. You could tell that change was in the air in Thailand at the time. There are some famous events that took place, political issues at the time, and everywhere you looked, there were new things being built in Bangkok. Yet the cityscape was still predominantly made up of shop houses, and while high-rise buildings were on the up, the old ways of Bangkok still appeared to have more influence over the city than the new, and this is something that would change rapidly as time went on. Bangkok became my new favourite city. The islands in Thailand would become the place that I could go and turn off. When I returned home, it was my dream to go back to Thailand to get into business there and perhaps replicate the success I had during my first business in Hong Kong. First things first, though, I needed to return home and make sure I could get my finances in order to be able to take that step. I returned to England in 1992, fully expecting to be back in Thailand before the year was out. Yet an opportunity presented itself to me with the same friend I got into business with before, and that was something that took out the next 5 years of my life. We had tremendous success in the business to start with, yet it faded over time and we found ourselves pumping more money into it than we should have, and instead of cutting our losses and taking the profits we had in the beginning, we went a bit too far. But what it did mean was, when it came to a close, there was enough money for me to go to Thailand and follow that dream because it was always there in the back of my mind throughout the entirety of the 5 years since I left. I don't know what it was or why Thailand could never be shifted out of my thoughts. It was like Thailand had planted the seed in my head, and that seed was growing into something more, and I was powerless to stop it. I arrived in Thailand in early 1997, this time with plans to stay, and I was looking around for different opportunities that I wanted to do. I couldn't have picked a worse year, I guess, on the surface, because 1997 was the Asian financial crisis that started in Thailand. Yet one thing that did mean was the Thai baht depreciated in value considerably, and I was lucky that I didn't fund any opportunities early in the year because I would have lost a fortune. I played it by ear throughout the whole of 1997, leaving and entering Thailand in order to get more time in the country, and 1998 rolls round and I think that I'd like to get back into the bar business like I did for my first business in Hong Kong. You could definitely tell that change was in the air. It was difficult to see so many businesses go under after 1997. Lots of companies had borrowed money in dollars when the baht was pegged to the dollar, and when the baht was floated, it depreciated rapidly, causing many people to lose everything. There is still that building today next to the river, which is a remnant of that time, the Ghost Tower, and I was one of the fortunate ones who had the privilege of walking to the top of that building when it was still possible to do so. That was a long time ago now, and you even encountered people living in it from time to time. But getting to the top and looking out over the city was an experience like no other. I guess it was probably halfway through 1998 when I started looking for the perfect place to open a bar. I kept going back to that idea because of how much fun I had back in Hong Kong. And during this time, the makeup of that part of Bangkok was considerably different to what it is today. I'm talking about the lower Sukhumvit parts of Bangkok, from where you exit the highway onto Sukhumvit Road, a place where they used to have bars at the time, all the way up to the Asok intersection close to Soi Cowboy. This was the part of the city I was interested in, and at the time it was a lot more open and there were a lot more bars there. I've heard it described this way before, but for anybody who was familiar with Pattaya today, I guess that part of Bangkok I'm talking about felt similar then to how Pattaya feels, a bit further into the future. It's coming up to 2 years of me being in Thailand, and it really is time I started to do something because my money wouldn't last forever. And I centered my focus on a complex of bars in this part of Bangkok. It was a big complex and it seemed to be changing rapidly. New bars were opening up all the time, other shops were being introduced, there were places to go for a massage, and it felt to me like it would be the perfect location to open my new bar. I think it's worthwhile also mentioning that 6 months prior to me opening my bar in Thailand, I did get married to my Thai partner. I am thankful to report that we are still together today, through thick and thin, as they say, and it would be her that I would open the bar with. What actually turned out happening was there was an owner who wanted to sell their bar. It was already kitted out with everything that you would need, it already had staff on the books, and it was a running business. And it wasn't without months of careful planning and consideration and thinking about all the pitfalls and things that could go wrong before we actually invested in the bar. I decided I wanted to do everything through a Thai limited company. As a foreigner, I wasn't able to own all of it, and at the time you needed 7 shareholders, which made things a lot more complicated than they are today. I also wanted to get a work permit so I could legally work there, but after a lot of back and forth with the legal agent I'd appointed to assist, I ultimately decided it would be easier to just do everything in the name of my Thai wife. When I say I planned to work there, I was never going to be the face of the business, so me sitting there and just talking to the staff wouldn't necessarily be considered excessive work. At least at the time, things were slightly more laid back than they are today. So after all the due diligence, all the careful planning, we purchased the bar from the old owner and took over the lease, which had most of the 3 years left on it. My wife became the new owner of the bar in 1998, close to 1999. And the first day that we opened as the new owners, it felt like we'd made a wonderful decision. The bar was an instant success, and it really did feel like I was picking up where I left off after closing the first bar that I ever opened in Hong Kong. It was an industry that I felt passionate about. It excited me in a way that other business I'd done never did. Perhaps it was the social side to it, meeting people that went to drink in your bar. We had girls working there who didn't have the benefits that people do today of the internet and broadened opportunities to do different things. It really did feel like we were at the precipice, moving into a new century soon, and it was my hope and dream to continue expanding our business, to open more bars, and to also start looking into other industries, which fascinated me. One of the things very early on that I struggled with in Thailand was the inability to own land as a foreigner. It meant doing things were more difficult, and I had to trust my wife to do everything that I wanted to do. This, in itself, wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Yet I never felt a deep connection to Thailand like I did to Hong Kong, but that didn't stop me from wanting to continue from where we started. At this point in my life, I did start to get drawn in a little bit too deep to this scene in Bangkok that I found myself getting a bit addicted to. We had our own bar, but it wasn't uncommon for me to spend time in other bars run by other expats or by locals. It felt more like a community back then than it does today. The industry was a lot more open and widespread, and it was a part of Bangkok that I still miss today. But instead of concentrating on running the bar from behind the scenes, I left that up to my wife, and I think I went off the rails for a year. I like to call it my crazy year if I look back at it, because I'd start the day and we'd already be at 7 pm, and I would be in our bar making sure everything was okay before leaving, and I would be finishing up later, all the way in the dead of night, many hours later, in fact, after spending time in lots of other bars. I got caught up in the scene, and it wasn't until my wife sat me down one day and just said, "We need to change, you need to do something different." I guess this was around the early 2000s, and I did realize I was not concentrating on what I should be concentrating on, which was to try to make our business succeed and expand into other areas and maybe open more bars. I did find that it was a common trait among some of the owners of the bars in Bangkok at the time. Many of the guys that opened bars did so because they had a love for the bars, and to them it was the next logical step from drinking in the bars all the time to owning a bar. And many of the people went into this and lost money and didn't make good things from it. For me at least, it was slightly different because I had a background in running a successful bar, and it was from that successful bar that I got drawn into the scene, and I was pretty much out of action for a whole year until I really had a conversation with myself and said, "You need to pull yourself out of it." With that in mind, my wife and I left the bar for a few weeks in the capable hands of our staff and left Bangkok so I could try to get my head back in the game. This would turn out to be a very fortuitous trip because it would open up different parts of Thailand to me that I had not yet spent time researching. This was going to be my first time in Pattaya. It was a place I'd heard talked about often. Lots of the guys who came into our bar spoke of Pattaya, and people I spoke to around Bangkok also spoke about it, and for some reason I had never been. Bangkok was the place I fell in love with in Thailand, and I think it was also due to the fact that I loved Hong Kong so much and the big city feel of Bangkok. It excited me the most. But when I got to Pattaya, this must have been halfway through the year 2000, my wife by my side, it seemed to me like this could be the perfect place to open our second bar. Things seemed a lot more affordable in Pattaya. It wasn't the capital city after all, and land wasn't at a premium. It immediately came to my attention that, for not much investment, we could have another bar to complement the first one. I've listened to lots of stories at this point, and lots of people like to give their opinions about Pattaya and how it is today compared to how it was before. They seem to do the same for Bangkok as well, yet often describing these places how they were only 10 years ago. So I think it's only right if I talk about how I found it back when I went and compare it to now, because in my opinion, how things are today are better than how they were back then. I'm not one of these guys who harks back for days gone by. I am someone who cherishes watching places change and evolve with the passage of time. I don't think it my place to say things are worse or better than they were before, although I am okay to share my opinion that, like I said, I believe things are better than they were then. But if you want an accurate picture of Pattaya in the year 2000, I will give it to you. For a start, the tourists there were predominantly from Western countries. Predominantly, they were there for one thing and one thing alone, and there were hundreds of bars. Regulation was lighter, closing hours were lax, and again it felt like the Wild West in the East. It was chaotic, and while Pattaya today is still known for the bars, it feels a lot more toned down and less in your face. Before, the bar scene was the dominant thing in Pattaya, and that's what you went for. And the government over the years has done their best to try to make the city more than just that. There seemed to be more foreign owners back then, while there are some today, not as many as before. The rules were less stringent, and many people were just using nominees to open businesses. But I realised that if I was going to open a second bar, it would be time to do things properly. I feel like when we were in Pattaya, I got my head back in the game, and as much as I enjoyed going to the bars and drinking there, it was my plan to make bars available for other people to do that instead. Back then in Thailand, everything seemed like it was within reach. Everything felt possible if only you worked hard enough for it. I had visions of opening 1 or 2 bars every single year for 10 years, having a bar empire in Thailand. This is what I was dreaming about, but I knew you needed to walk before you could run, and we left Pattaya back to Bangkok. But I started thinking about opening that second place in Pattaya. I thought it was about time to form an actual company, to make myself legal, then we could use that vehicle to get the second bar. It took a good few months before the company was formed and everything was in place. Having to have 7 total shareholders was difficult, and you heard of people using nominees. But if you wanted to form a business, how were you able to find 6 other people to use as shareholders? I am happy that they have made it easier now than it was then. But aside from myself and my wife, we needed to find 5 more shareholders. So we ended up using a few of my Thai wife's family members, and that worked well for us. Because we already had a bar and staff working there, we were able to add them to the company, which meant I was able to get a work permit. That made me feel a lot more comfortable because I could actually do business out in the open now as opposed to behind the scenes. And now we're in 2001, and our bar in Bangkok is making reasonable money, and we left for Pattaya again to look for our second place. When I say our bar in Bangkok is making reasonable money, it's not making as much money as the bar I had in Hong Kong, nowhere near as much, but it's making enough for us to be able to live in Bangkok and go to Pattaya occasionally when needed. It's not making enough for us to be able to save money and purchase our own place to live. Yet, after only a year, I am very happy with how it's going. I felt, for being in Thailand and just how affordable things were back then, that we were doing well. But I wanted to do so much better than that, and it was the next logical step to open a new place. There's only so much you can do and make from one bar. You can't force people into it, so expansion was what appealed to me the most. In 2001, in Pattaya again, looking for a new bar. At the time, it was more affordable, especially in certain parts of the city, to purchase a bar, and I knew I would need to invest a little bit of money into this out of my savings. But the ultimate goal was to get to a point where all the bars we had made enough profit to be able to add one new bar every 3 months or so. That was my dream, and I was thinking big before we'd even begun. Needless to say, we never got there. But I want to talk about the dreams I had and why I was doing what I did. I didn't want to be the guy who just opened a bar and that was it. I wanted to be a guy that owned a chain of bars that bought out other people's bars, and at the time, everything like this felt so possible and within reach. We spent the next 6 months looking for the perfect place in Pattaya, back and forth to Bangkok regularly to check up on our place there. But we were lucky in the sense that we had great staff that ran the bar, just as we would have done. When we eventually found the place we wanted in Pattaya, it was on a street called Soi Bukaw. It still felt like it was developing as a street with room to grow and change over time, so I felt like getting in at this stage would be beneficial. At the time, the rent wasn't a fortune and it didn't cost a lot of money to buy out one of these bars. Again, I don't want to give away any information or more than I need to because it was a long time ago. But at the start of 2002, we were now the new owners of the place we found, everything legally done through our Thai company, and I wanted to spend some time there in the early days to make sure things went smoothly. My wife decided to go back to Bangkok to make sure things continued to go well there. It was around this time that I was considering employing a full-time manager to manage both of the bars and who would be able to manage more bars that we would add further down the line. If we had to manage them ourselves, there would be a limit on how many we could have, and I was already thinking about the bigger picture when we opened. It was a very interesting scene back then in Pattaya, so very different to how it is today. It's hard for anybody to actually picture what it was like unless they'd actually been. But I quickly found that the bar we bought was bringing in a reasonable amount of money every month. We spent months and months finding it, doing all the due diligence we could, even though you could still do all this due diligence and the books you're reviewing could have been doctored or completely fabricated. So it's not just looking at the books, there were lots of other things that I did in order to determine if I thought it was a good investment or not. But after being there for 3 months, throughout the whole of the opening stage, I was happy to leave it with the staff and return to Bangkok. Our lease had come up for renewal at our bar in Bangkok, and in early 2002, we extended this for a further 3 years. The amount we were paying in rent had gone up, but it wasn't a considerable change, and it was manageable, and we were happy to continue. And while this might not be relevant to my story, I have heard lots of cases over the years of rents being doubled or even trebled, and the owners of the bars having to leave, and the owners of the building coming in and taking over an already successful bar. I've heard this happening to lots of people throughout the years, and it's something that you need to be careful of. You have to picture it like this. You leased a building in a good area, but perhaps not the best area. You open a bar there and things are going well, people come in, and next door people do the same thing, and the street turns into more than it was. The lease comes up for renewal, and of course the price goes up. Yet oftentimes, because the business is so successful, the owner of the property wants a piece of the action and will put up the rent so high that you can't compete. So all your investment is lost and the bar can be opened by the new owner. Or they can find someone to rent it for a lot more. So I think that's the only thing that I was wary of as being possible. It meant I always wanted to be in a position where if we weren't able to renew the lease, we were able to adapt and not have too much tied up in the business where something like that would be a loss. Luckily, that never actually happened to us, yet what did happen was far worse. And what I'm trying to say is that you can be as careful as possible, you can think you're being the most diligent person the world has ever seen, but in Thailand there will always be something that could trip you up, or make something harder than it should be. And while today things are improving in Thailand, it still is something you need to be careful of. But the lease on our bar in Bangkok was renewed without incident, and now we had two bars that were bringing in reasonable amounts of money. It's an awful lot of work making sure that the staff are always showing up and working properly, yet each bar had somebody that worked there to make sure the staff did things properly. In Thailand, they're known as the Mama San. We started thinking about buying a third bar. Again, this was in 2002. We spent a lot of time thinking if we wanted another bar in Bangkok or another bar in Pattaya. And one thing that I was noticing, even all the way back then, was that Bangkok was gentrifying and Pattaya was the exact opposite of that. Bangkok still had an awful long way to go, even to get to where we are today. And the bars there, all over that part of Bangkok, were reducing in number, bit by bit. But from time to time, you would see bars completely disappearing. And while I thought that this was years in the making and we could still have tremendous success in Bangkok, I decided that another bar in Pattaya, which was solely focused on that industry at the time, would be the best option. It took a few months to come to that decision, looking around at what was available and just getting an overall feel of the place by speaking to other owners, both foreign and Thai. It wasn't just me coming up with an idea and thinking that sounds good and doing it. A lot of careful and hard work went into the decisions we made, and I guess that's why the first two bars we had were going well. Halfway through 2002, I went back to Pattaya. We were going back and forth between Bangkok and Pattaya all the time, but usually we'd stay in Pattaya for a few days, and then go back to Bangkok. When I said I went back, I meant for an extended period of time, and I spent 3 months looking for another place to add to our growing business. I had two different opinions at the time. Do we get another bar on the same street as we already have one and grow our presence on the street? Or do we open up on a different street in a different part of town so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket? And throughout those 3 months, I looked at lots of places and spoke to lots of people, but I didn't find anywhere that I felt was perfect at the time. I thought I would go back in a few months for another look, which would be pushing the end of 2002. I need to say that at this time I am feeling like everything is going right. I didn't think anything could go wrong as long as we worked hard enough and made sure that we always did things properly and always did our research and due diligence before we invested into anything else. We returned to Pattaya again to look around at the end of 2002. We planned to spend New Year there, and then we planned to spend a few months with the idea of definitely finding our third bar. The idea was that we would not leave Pattaya until we found somewhere. If it was going to drag on a bit longer, then my wife could go back to Bangkok. But we celebrated New Year, had a few days break, and in January 2003 we started our hunt for the perfect third place. We ultimately thought it would be the best thing to do to get a bar on the same street that we already had one on, and there were a few available at the time. We were speaking to one owner, and we were very close to coming to an agreement for a place. Then, one morning, we received a call from one of our staff members in Bangkok. That's when all our plans, all our dreams, and our big ambitions were humbled. Let's just say that the bar that we had in Bangkok, and all the other bars that were in the same complex, were not there anymore. I think if you were there at the time, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'm not prepared to say more than that. All of a sudden, though, we lost our bar in Bangkok. When I say it wasn't there anymore, I mean the physical structure was not there anymore, and that was a rude wake-up call and something that you would never think would happen. This quickly put an end to our idea to open a third place. I'd lost all confidence in the country at that point, because something like this happened and it shouldn't have done. I guess the way I reacted to it was wrong. I took it personally and I got back into drinking and going to the bars for pleasure as opposed to a means to make money. And because of what happened and the investment we had there was completely lost. And that part was the one that was making us the most money. The one in Pattaya wasn't even enough to cover our entire living expenses. We didn't want to buy another bar because at that point I had visions of more things happening like this. And even though the chance of that happening was low, I did start to feel very paranoid and concerned that investing more money would lead to even more loss. And with that in mind, we put our bar up for sale in Pattaya and got rid of it after a few months for a small loss. I think we reacted with haste. What I wish I did, more than anything, is just continued down the same path that we were going down. But because of what happened, I lost confidence not only in the country, but in myself. And because of that, we lost quite a lot of money, and we probably spent the next year in Thailand going crazy. My wife, like me, was equally as devastated, but she was wanting to get back into business, while I wanted nothing more than to go out to drink, and we blew through a lot of money, not making anything, and we came to the decision in 2004 to leave Thailand and go to England. I would take my wife with me to England. She'd never been there before, and that's what we did. I really regret that decision that we made because I think that we were moving in the right direction. Things were going well, and we should have written off that incident as being a one off, something that would never happen again, and continue with the plan we had. Because if we did that, not only could we have stayed in Thailand, but I think we could have built something that we could have been proud of. But people react to different events in different ways, and moving to England was what I thought was the safest thing to do. Perhaps it wouldn't be the most fun thing to do, but in England, something like that just wouldn't happen. And if it did, there would be something you could do about it. But in Thailand, there are still articles even today cropping up that talk about this. Suppose it was a big thing in Thailand as well. But I just witnessed it and experienced it, got paranoid and thought it's going to continue to happen like that. But if you look back since, there haven't really been any big things like that again. We didn't step foot back in Thailand until 2014. By that point, my wife had already got a British passport. We started a business there, which we sold and invested the money into a few rental properties, and we moved to Thailand, retired. While we were successful in England, when we were doing what we did, it wasn't as fun or exhilarating as the business we had in Thailand. It was as if our business in England was a means to an end, whereas what we were doing in Thailand before was a lifestyle, a passion, and making money was a bonus on top. But we can't complain because we are now living in Thailand and we have a great life here. I did what many people have done, yet failed at doing, which is build a house in my wife's village. We built that when we got back in 2014, yet it wasn't our intention to live there all the time. We spend between 3 to 6 months a year there, and the rest we spend in Pattaya. We have a condo there with great views out to the ocean, and we're lucky in the sense that we have a great building manager who doesn't allow Airbnb like many places do, so we do have a good life in Thailand. I've been with my wife for over 20 years, and our relationship has been solid throughout that whole time. Thailand changed me in so many more ways than one. It made me appreciate a few of the things from the country I came from, yet it made me realize that if you want perfection, you're probably not going to find it. Perfection, though, is open to interpretation, and I've come on a long way in my opinions since all the way back then. Thailand will be where I see out my days. I love most of the things about Thailand. I don't think about how Thailand used to be and wish it was like that. I love how Thailand is right now. I love Pattaya right now. And yes, it is nothing like it used to be, but nowhere is. The fact that I can leave my condo and in 5 minutes be walking along the beach. Granted, I wouldn't want to swim in the sea there, but I only need to travel for a few hours if I want to do that. After walking on the beach, I can go for any cuisine that takes my fancy from any country. I can go for a drink in a bar. And if you want to go and do something completely different, there are amazing 5-star luxury hotels and restaurants that serve some amazing food. Pattaya really has it all. I love Bangkok equally as much, yet we only spend a couple of weeks a year there. The place where we had our bar has changed over the years. On the thoughts I was having all the way back then in early 2000s about how Bangkok is going to gentrify and continue moving away from how I found it, all these thoughts were pretty spot on. But how Bangkok is today is equally as wonderful as how it used to be. And it's amazing when you've spent such a long time in a place and you've seen it progress throughout the course of nearly 4 decades. But it's amazing at just how much you learn to appreciate being part of that change. I would say to anybody, if you're interested in Thailand, just go and look for yourself. I do consider myself one of the fortunate ones, regardless of what happened all those years ago. I've never had any problems with my wife, and our relationship has continued to get better. I think I owe this success to being privy to lots of things that happened to lots of people in Thailand. Off the top of my head, I can think about 10 people who I've known throughout the years. 9 of them who fell in love with Thailand, got married in Thailand, did things in Thailand, and had to return home as failures. Only one of those people was successful in Thailand and never had to return. So if you're going by those odds, you're 10% likely to succeed. Well, I did fail because of events completely out of my control and things happening that under any normal circumstances would never have happened. And also because I let that get the better of me as opposed to trying to brush it off and move forwards. I am still in Thailand today, I'm still with my wife, and there's nowhere I would rather be. Most definitely nowhere I love as much as Thailand, and that is a fact.